Fire, blood, and gunfire. That was the night Levi Calloway learned exactly what a woman's cut-off scream would cost him, and what it would give back to a man who had stopped believing in either. The barn was already past saving by the time he staggered clear of the smoke, one sleeve black and stiff with his own blood, the old dry timbers cracking and screaming under a blaze that had eaten through the roof in minutes. Horses shrieked inside the corral fence, throwing themselves against the rails hard enough to splinter wood, and from the north ridge came torches, not 10, not 20, but near 30 of them, bobbing down through the dark like 100 small red eyes with no faces behind them, no war cries, nothing but the low, relentless drum of hooves and a wall of smoke thick enough to taste on the back of the tongue. Levi went down behind the water trough with an empty rifle in his hands and no plan beyond staying alive long enough to matter. Sparks rained down around him in slow orange drifts, catching in the dry grass, and somewhere behind the barn a support beam gave way with a groan that sounded almost human, when a bullet split the air an inch off his ear. A shape stepped clear of the flames with a revolver already leveled, and for one endless second he had no way of knowing whether it had come to finish him or to stand between him and the men who wanted him dead. Arizona Territory, 1882. 9 days from that moment stretched behind it a story that had started, of all places, at a quiet creek, with a scream, a stranger, and a decision Levi almost didn't make. There is a particular silence that moves into a house after a woman has died in it. A silence with real weight to it, the kind that settles into the floorboards and the curtains and doesn't leave when company comes. Levi Calloway had been living inside that silence for going on 2 years. Ever since his wife Mara took a fever no doctor in the territory could break, and was gone before the cottonwoods along the creek had even finished turning that autumn. Mornings were the worst of it. Mara used to hum some tune she'd never once put a name to while she worked the stove, and Levi never learned what it was called, assuming, the way a young husband assumes most things, that there would always be more time for that. There wasn't. He still kept her sewing basket on the shelf by the window exactly where she'd left it, the needle still threaded, though he could never quite say why he hadn't put it away. Now he ran the ranch alone, cattle, fences, the dozen small chores that used to split easily between 2 pairs of hands, and now sat on his shoulders, like a yoke he'd stopped noticing the weight of. His nearest neighbors were the Hollis family 2 miles east, and old man Prewitt, a widower himself, camped near the creek to the west. Beyond that, for a long stretch in every direction, there was only sky and sage, and the low blue shoulders of the Rincon foothills, and Levi had grown almost fond of how little any of it demanded of him. He spent more hours talking to the cattle than to people most weeks, and figured that suited him fine, though some nights the fine wore thinner than others. What almost nobody in the valley knew, because Levi kept it to himself, and Mara herself had rarely spoken of it, was that at 16 years old, back before her family staked this land, Mara had once hidden a wounded Apache man from a company of soldiers who'd have shot him where he lay, keeping him fed in the root cellar for 11 days until he was strong enough to travel. She never explained afterward why she'd done it, only that some things a person simply does, the way you'd pull a drowning man out of a river without first asking whether he could swim or what he'd done to end up in the water. Levi hadn't thought about that story in years, folded away the way most inherited stories get folded once the person who lived them is gone. He would think about it again soon enough, and understand it a great deal better than he ever had. The silence of the ranch was broken, that particular spring, by a letter that arrived folded once and sealed with hard red wax, the kind of letter a man reads twice before he lets himself believe what it's asking of him. It came from a land and water company man named Silas Crane, who had spent the better part of 2 years buying up the water rights along the upper Silver Creek, not by any means a court would call illegal, but by the quieter method of holding a neighbor's debts in one hand and a pen in the other. Crane's letter proposed $95 for Levi's share of the creek water, a fraction of what it was truly worth to a ranch that couldn't survive a dry summer without it. 2 of Levi's neighbors, the Hollises and old Prewitt, had already signed similar papers. Worn down by droughts and debts, Crane's company had quietly financed in better years, and now demanded in full in the worst of them. Each signature obtained with a patience that looked, from a distance, almost like kindness. Crane himself was not the kind of villain who raised his voice or drew a gun personally if he could help it. He preferred the slower, cleaner cruelty of paperwork and patience, buying up a man's debts years before he ever needed to call on them, then simply waiting for a dry season to do the rest of the persuading for him. He had done this in 2 other counties already, quietly enough that no single ruined family ever quite realized the pattern stretched wider than their own bad luck, and he saw no particular reason this valley should prove any different from the last 2. Levi read the letter twice by lamplight, folded it back along its original creases, and fed it into the tack room stove without a reply. Some answers he'd come to believe needed no ink at all. He tried not to think much more about Crane after that, though the letter's absence from his desk left a small unease behind it that took him a while to name. It was an ordinary afternoon 2 weeks later when Levi rode down to check the lower fence line along the creek, and heard a woman's voice cut off mid-word, sharp and then silent, in a way that raised every hair on his arms. Most men on that stretch of frontier, hearing trouble ahead on land that wasn't theirs, would have turned their horse the other direction and ridden hard for home, telling themselves later it was none of their business. Levi turned toward it instead, without giving himself time enough to think better of it. He came around a stand of cottonwoods to find a young Apache woman fighting 3 of Crane's hired riders at the water's edge, her wrists already caught by one man's fist, her dark hair loose and wild, where someone had torn the tie from it, a second man reaching for a length of rope coiled at his saddle horn. She was not screaming for help so much as she was still fighting, teeth bared, a river rock gripped hard enough in her free hand to draw blood if it landed, and Levi understood in that half-second that she'd have gone down swinging regardless of whether anyone came at all. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she'd done to deserve 3 grown men laying hands on her. He put his horse straight at them and went in with his fists and the flat of a shovel he'd had lashed to his saddle, catching the rope man across the shoulder hard enough to drop him, and inside 2 furious minutes the 3 riders were retreating toward their own horses, cursing, one of them limping badly, none of them eager to explain to Crane exactly how they'd lost a fight to one rancher and an Apache woman who was still throwing punches even after Levi had pulled her half behind him. She looked at him then, really looked, dark eyes steady despite the torn sleeve and the raw mark already rising on her wrist. You didn't have to do that." Her voice held no thanks in it yet, only a kind of wary appraisal, as if she were still deciding what kind of man had just ridden into her fight uninvited, and whether that kind of man could be trusted any further than the moment required. "Didn't look like a fair number," Levi managed, still catching his breath, and something in the dry economy of it made the corner of her mouth twitch, almost a smile, gone before it could fully arrive. He gave his name. She gave hers back, Elu, and let him walk her horse to where the trees thinned before she rode off alone, refusing an escort with a firmness that brooked no argument whatsoever. Levi rode home, turning the whole strange hour over in his mind, unconvinced by his own effort to call it over and done with. It was not over. If you're the kind of viewer who's already invested in how this turns out, this next part is worth staying for, because 3 days later, Levi Calloway would learn there was a great deal more watching him than he had ever imagined, and had been quietly for far longer than 3 days. 3 mornings after the creek, Levi walked out to feed his stock before dawn, and found the ridge above his house lined with riders, 30 of them at least, mounted and utterly silent, watching his house the way a hawk watches a field before it decides whether the field is worth the trouble of a strike. His first instinct was to reach for the rifle by the door. His second, slower instinct, the one that had kept him alive plenty of times before, told him to wait and see what 30 silent riders actually wanted before he gave them any reason to want something worse from him. A single rider broke from the line and came down at a walk. Elu, dressed for travel now rather than the creek, her chin level, riding just ahead and slightly to the side of an older man whose bearing left no doubt at all he was the one the others answered to. This was her father, and though Levi didn't yet know the word for it, every line of the old man's posture said chief plainly enough. Through Elu's translation, the chief put 3 questions to Levi, plain and unhurried, as if the answers mattered more to him than anything else in the world that particular morning. "When you helped my daughter at the creek, did you know who she was?" Levi shook his head. "Did you know we were watching your land, watching what kind of man you are when you believe no one at all can see you?" He shook his head again, honestly bewildered by the whole scale of it. "Then why," came the question through Elu, "did you do it at all, if it cost you nothing to walk away instead?" Levi took his time with that one, longer than the first 2, because it deserved the extra thought. She was a woman being hurt by men who had no right to lay a hand on her. That she was Apache, that she was anybody's daughter, none of that mattered to what I did in that moment. She'd done nothing wrong. That was reason enough on its own. Elu, standing just behind her father's shoulder and translating each careful phrase, found her own voice steadying as the words left her, as though she too were hearing Levi's answer fully for the first time, despite having witnessed the moment at the creek herself. She had spent 3 days telling herself the man's actions at the creek had been simple instinct, nothing more, the kind of reflexive decency any half-decent stranger might show without it meaning much of anything lasting. And standing there now, watching him answer her father plainly, rather than reach for whatever answer he thought the chief wanted to hear, she found that explanation considerably harder to hold on to than it had been 3 mornings before. The chief went very still at that answer, studying Levi's face the way a man studies ground he's seriously considering building something permanent on. A long moment passed before Elu's voice carried his answer plainly across the yard. "We have watched this valley and this ranch for 3 days. We wish to know what kind of man lives here when he believes he is entirely alone. Most who have come to this land before you were not good men. The water company took what wasn't theirs to take, and let cattle ruin creek ground our people used long before any paper claimed it. And we have not forgotten who pushed us onto the harder, drier ground beyond the ridge, nor forgiven it easily. You are different, not because you believe yourself better than other men who've come here, because of what you do when no one at all is watching you do it. You have passed the test we set for you 3 days ago." What the chief did not say aloud that morning, though Elu would tell Levi much of it later over many slow afternoons at the creek, was how much this particular test had cost her people to set up and see through. Her band had watched ranchers move into this valley for years, most of them takers, men who saw creek water and grazing land and never once saw the people who'd tended both for generations before a single survey stake went into the ground. Elu herself had volunteered to be the one at the creek, knowing full well the real risk of it, because her father had wanted proof rather than promises, before he'd risk his people's trust on one more white rancher's good intentions dressed up in neighborly manners. Levi Calloway had passed a test he never knew he was taking, and Elu, watching him absorb all of this without flinching or arguing, found herself quietly reconsidering the flat, guarded opinion of him she'd formed at the creek 3 days before. Elu's own family filled her days a great deal more than Levi had first assumed from the outside. Her mother had died the winter before, of a lung sickness the camp's own medicine woman had fought hard and lost to, and Elu had quietly taken up much of her mother's work since then, tending the younger children when their own mothers were occupied, keeping the peace between two aunts who disagreed about nearly everything except how fiercely they loved the same nieces and nephews, and sitting in on her father's counsels, far more often than most daughters were asked to, because the old chief had come to trust her judgment nearly as much as his own. Her older brother, Taji, teased her mercilessly about the ranch visits, once word of them spread through camp, though even his teasing carried a rough current of approval underneath it, the particular kind brothers give when they're genuinely glad to see a sister happy rather than simply amused at her expense. Twice a week after that, Elu began riding down to the creek, sometimes with 2 or 3 other young women from her band, sometimes alone when the work of the camp allowed it, ostensibly to trade dried meat and woven goods for the tools and cloth Levi's ranch could spare, but mostly both of them slowly admitted to themselves, before they'd admit it to each other, to talk. She began teaching him words in her own language, starting simple: water, horse, friend, sky, with a dry patience that had a blade of wit hidden somewhere inside it. No, came the correction the 3rd time he mangled the word for water, Elu laughing despite herself at his flat, careful pronunciation. You're saying it like a man asking a trading post clerk for supplies he doesn't actually need. Softer. Again. He tried again, worse if anything, and she laughed outright this time, a real laugh, head tipped back, and Levi realized with a small private shock that he was laughing too, genuinely, from somewhere low in his chest, a sound he hadn't been sure still lived in him at all since Mara died. Elu was not, Levi came to learn over those slow weeks, simply the chief's daughter waiting quietly for a husband to be chosen for her. She tracked better than any two of her brothers combined, could read a coming storm off the shape of the clouds over the Rincon foothills a full day before Levi's own instincts caught up, and had already turned down 2 respectable offers of marriage within her own band, because neither man had struck her as worth the trouble of rearranging her whole life around. She shared this last part herself, one afternoon, with the particular bluntness Levi had come to understand was simply how she moved through the world. No decoration on the truth, no softening it for anyone's comfort, least of all her own. "My father worries I'll never marry." She watched a hawk circle the far ridge. "I've made clear to him I intend to marry exactly once, and only once I'm certain, and that a man's worth waiting on for as long as it takes." "How will you know when you're certain?" "I expect I'll know." She left it there, unelaborated, though something in the flatness of it made Levi's chest go tight in a way he hadn't expected. Their afternoons at the creek stretched longer with every visit, banter sharpening into something neither of them named aloud yet. Elu had a gift for cutting straight through any careful thing Levi tried to say, the way she once put it, half amused and half exasperated. "I'm getting tired of being your translator every single time somebody tries to kill you." "That's a fair complaint, seeing as it keeps happening to me and not to you." "It's happening to you because you keep riding toward trouble instead of away from it, same as you did the day we met." "So did you, the day we met." "And you still can't cook worth a single damn," glancing pointedly at the blackened pan he'd left drying by the fire pit, "which I suppose is its own kind of trouble, if a slower one. I've kept myself alive 2 years on that cooking. Barely. And only because your cattle don't have opinions about it." He laughed at that harder than the joke strictly earned, mostly at the easy, unguarded way it landed, the way a person only teases another person they've decided, somewhere along the line without quite announcing it, that they intend to keep around. That one landed somewhere he could see it land, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, just sat with the creek running cool and steady between them, and the unspoken fact that they were both, in their separate ways, people who rode toward the sound of trouble rather than away from it. There came an evening, too, when Elu finally raised the subject of Mara directly, rather than skirting it the careful way most people in the valley still did around him. "You still keep her basket on the shelf," not unkindly, nodding toward the window. "I've noticed it every time I've come inside." Levi didn't flinch from it the way he once might have. "I kept thinking I'd know when it was time to put it away. 2 years, and I still don't know." Elu considered that a long moment. "Perhaps it isn't a thing you put away at all. Perhaps you simply make room beside it for what comes next, and let both things sit together on the same shelf." Levi turned that over for days afterward, and when he finally did move the basket, it wasn't to hide it in some drawer out of sight, but to a smaller shelf nearer the door, where he'd see it every morning on his way out. Not as a wound anymore, but as a marker of a life that had shaped the man now building a second one. She brought him a poultice once, unasked, when a bad cut on his hand from mending fence had gone hot and swollen past what he was willing to admit was serious. She stayed silent about his stubbornness while she worked, only pressed the crushed leaves against the wound with brisk, sure hands, and it was only after the swelling had gone down over the following days that the dry observation finally came, that a man who lived alone had nobody around to notice when he was quietly killing himself through pure inconvenience. You'd have let that hand rot off before you rode for a doctor. I would have ridden eventually. Eventually is a poor plan for a man with only one working hand to begin with. He had no honest answer for that. There was one afternoon, though, when the easy banter fell away entirely. Levi put the question to her outright, watching the creek rather than her face because it was easier that way, whether her father would ever truly accept a match between his daughter and a rancher who wasn't Apache at all, no matter how many tests that rancher passed. Elu stayed quiet long enough that he thought he'd overstepped some line he hadn't known was there. My father judges a man by what he does, not by which world he was born into. This much he has made plain to me himself, more than once, since long before you ever rode into any of it. The harder question isn't whether he'd accept you. It's whether you're prepared for how much of my world you'd be carrying alongside your own, every single day, for the rest of a life you're choosing rather than simply falling into. Levi weighed that a long while before he found his answer. I've been carrying half a life alone for 2 years. Carrying a fuller one, even a harder one, sounds like the better trade to me by a wide margin. She looked at him, then the way she hadn't quite let herself look at him before, and neither of them raised the subject again that day, though something between them had plainly shifted for good. Before this story rides any further, a quick word for anyone who loves these slow-burn frontier romances. Become a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name. It's a small way to help keep stories like this one coming. Silas Crane did not take kindly to losing his hired men's fight at the creek, nor to the sight, reported back to him within days by writers he still paid well, of an Apache woman and a stubborn young rancher spending long afternoons together on land he badly wanted for himself. His letters to Levi turned sharper for a time, then stopped altogether, replaced by something worse: silence. The particular silence of a man rearranging his plans rather than abandoning them entirely. Word reached Levi through the Hollis family that Crane had begun pressing them harder than before, threatening to call their debt due in full within the month unless they persuaded their neighbor to see reason about the water rights, a pressure that left the Hollises apologetic and afraid in equal measure when they finally rode over to warn him of it themselves. Crane, for his part, had not given up so easily on a quieter solution than the one he eventually chose. He rode out to Elu's father directly that same week, alone save for a single translator of his own hire, and proposed the old chief a settlement of sorts, safe passage for his people through Crane's newly claimed waterlands, in exchange for the chief simply withdrawing whatever protection he'd extended to one stubborn rancher. The chief heard the whole proposal out in complete silence, a courtesy Crane clearly mistook for consideration, and then, through his own translator rather than Crane's, so there could be no argument later about what had actually passed between them. You offer me safe passage across land that was never yours to control passage over in the first place. I have no need of a gift built from a theft.
take your offer back the way you brought it." Crane rode away from that meeting angrier than he'd arrived, and it was that same anger, more than any of Levi's stubbornness alone, that finally pushed him toward the men he hired next.
It was Elu who warned Levi more urgently still, riding down to the ranch alone one gray morning, with real fear showing plainly in her face for the first time since he'd known her. Dismounting fast, skipping the easy banter that usually opened their visits. "My father's scouts say Crane rode north to hire more men than he already keeps. Men who don't care whose water this is, only what they're paid to take and how quickly." Levi wondered aloud, only half joking, what exactly a man was supposed to do against a small hired army. You are not against them alone. Flat and certain, and something in that plain declaration settled something in his chest that had been unsettled since the day Mara died. The simple, welcome fact of no longer standing entirely by himself against whatever came next. Crane came himself 2 mornings later, riding up the lane at the head of a dozen armed men, expecting an empty yard and an easy signature waiting on it. He found instead 30 Apache riders arranged in silent, unhurried ranks along the ridge above Levi's house, Elu and her father among them, and Levi standing squarely on his own porch with a rifle he had no intention of using unless he absolutely had to. The standoff held for a long, taut minute, nobody moving, dust settling slow around the horses' feet, the whole valley gone quiet enough to hear a hawk cry somewhere far off over the foothills. Crane finally broke the silence himself, wheeling his horse back toward the road with the careless unconcern of a man who has simply changed his mind about the day's schedule, rather than lost the argument outright. This isn't over. Unhurried, almost bored by his own threat, and he rode south at an easy trot, as if he had all the time left in the world to prove it true. Levi watched him go and felt no relief at all, only a cold, settling certainty that Crane had meant precisely what he'd shown. Crane meant it. 9 nights later, long after the lamps were out and the ranch had gone fully quiet, fire tore through Levi's barn roof, and 30 riders came down off the north ridge under cover of torches and darkness. Exactly the storm this story opened inside of. Levi woke to the horses screaming, and was in the yard within a minute of the first flame catching, one shoulder still bare where he'd pulled his shirt on wrong in the dark, a rifle in his hands that he hadn't had time to properly load before the first shots came. A bullet caught his forearm early in the fight, a hot, tearing line of pain that dropped him briefly behind the water trough, with blood running fast and warm down to his wrist, the barn's dry old timbers cracking and shrieking overhead as fire ate through them beam by beam. He had gone down behind that trough with no plan beyond staying alive long enough to matter, when the shape stepped out of the flames with a revolver already raised, and it was Elu, hair loose and wild in the firelight, planting herself directly between Levi and the raiders' guns without a moment's hesitation, exactly as she'd once fought 3 armed men alone at the creek, rather than simply wait somewhere safe to be rescued. Behind her came her father's warriors at a dead run, 30 riders who had been watching Levi's ranch long before this particular night, and had no intention of watching it burn to the ground without answering the fire in kind. The fight that followed was fast and ugly and lit orange from every direction at once. Crane's hired men caught between a blaze they'd set themselves and a defense they clearly hadn't fully accounted for when they'd ridden north to hire more guns. Horses reared and scattered through the smoke. A support post gave way somewhere behind the corral with a crack loud enough to be mistaken for a gunshot. The smell of scorched hair and hot metal hung thick over everything. Within a hard quarter hour, the raiders broke and scattered south, the same direction Crane himself had ridden 9 days before, leaving behind 2 of their own too badly hurt to run, and a scattering of dropped gear that would matter a great deal more than any of them realized in the coming days. Elu's brother Taji took a graze along his ribs early in the fighting, enough to knock the wind clean out of him and drop him hard against the corral fence. But he was back on his feet inside a minute, cursing fluently in 2 languages and throwing himself back into the fight beside his sister, with a ferocity that left no doubt at all where Elu's own fearlessness had first come from. It was Taji, in fact, who dragged one of Crane's fallen riders bodily away from the worst of the flames rather than leave him to burn, a small mercy nobody asked him to extend, and one that would matter a good deal. Later, when that same rider gave testimony against his own employer out of plain gratitude for still being alive to give it. Levi came up out of the smoke half carried by 2 of the chief's men, his sleeve black and soaked through with his own blood, and found Elu already there beside him, hands steady on the wound, despite everything they had both just survived together, her voice low and fierce, and entirely without need of translation now. "You are not dying on me." Tearing cloth for a bandage with hands that did not shake even now, even with the barn still collapsing in slow embers 30 feet away. "Not tonight. Not after everything we have already been through to get here." Dawn came up slow and reluctant that morning, as if the valley itself needed a moment to decide what it had survived. Smoke still hung low over the yard, catching gold in the first real light, and somewhere in the wreckage a single support beam finally gave way and settled with a soft final groan, the last sound the old barn would ever make. Birds that had gone silent through the whole fight began, tentatively, to call again from the cottonwoods along the creek, as though even they understood the worst of the night had finally passed. The barn was a total loss. Its roof collapsed inward into embers by the time the sun came up gray, and smoke hazed over the whole valley. But the house stood. The herd was mostly saved by riders who'd driven the panicked cattle clear of the fence line during the worst of the fighting, and Levi was alive, which was more than Crane's men had managed to take from him, no matter how hard they'd tried that night. Elu's father found Levi sitting against the corral fence at first light, arm bound tight, watching the barn's ruins smolder, with an expression the old chief clearly recognized from somewhere deep in his own long history with this same kind of loss. "Will you sell now?" Plain through Elu, though the question sounded almost like one final test all its own. Levi shook his head slowly, wincing at the movement. "I'm not going to sell, and I'm not going to run. This was Mara's land before it was ever mine, and this water was your people's before it was ever anyone's to sell at all. It was never Crane's to want in the first place, and it wasn't Crane's to burn." The chief studied him a long moment, then nodded once, as if some final measurement had settled itself in his mind for good and all. "That is the answer of a man who has stopped protecting a thing out of pure stubbornness and started protecting it because he finally understands exactly what it is worth to him and to the people around him. What neither Crane nor his hired men had accounted for was that a man burning down another man's barn in the dead of night leaves behind more evidence than ash: burned promissory notes, half legible in the wreckage, a coerced neighbor's confession, once the Hollis family realized how close they'd come to losing everything to the very same scheme, and a torn page of a company ledger one of Crane's fleeing riders dropped in his panic to escape 30 armed Apache warriors bearing down on him in the dark. Word of the raid reached the territorial marshal's office in the town of Larkspur within days, carried there in person by old Prewitt himself, who had finally decided a coerced signature was worth a good deal less than his own conscience once he'd seen with his own eyes what Crane's men were truly capable of. 15 miles is a long ride for a marshal to make in person, rather than simply send a deputy in his place, but 9 days after the fire, U.S. Marshal Otis Bragg rode the whole distance himself, a folded newspaper page from the territorial capital tucked inside his coat, detailing a water rights coercion scheme spreading quietly across 3 counties, with Silas Crane's name sitting square at the center of it. The marshal spent 2 full days in the valley taking statements from Levi, from the Hollis family, from old Prewitt, even from Elu's father through her own careful translation, a formality the marshal insisted on treating with the same seriousness he gave every other witness, which was not nothing in that particular year and territory. He interviewed the injured rider Taji had pulled clear of the fire as well, a man named Ferris, who gave up more against Crane in a single afternoon than the marshal had expected to get out of anyone on the payroll, plainly rattled by how close he'd come to burning and unwilling to protect a boss who'd never once cared whether his hired men made it out of a job alive. Ferris's account, laid alongside the burned ledger page and the coerced signatures, closed the last gap in the marshal's case, a fact he made plain to Levi before he rode the 15 miles back to Larkspur with Crane in custody behind him. Man built himself an empire on other people's fear. Fear only holds so long as nobody calls it. You called it, and so did they. He nodded toward the ridge, where a handful of Elu's people still stood watch, out of old habit more than necessity now. The marshal's evidence, once laid alongside the burned notes and Prewitt's sworn statement, and the Hollis family's own account of exactly how their signatures had been obtained, was more than enough to see Crane arrested within the week, his company's holdings frozen, pending a territorial hearing that would eventually return every coerced water right in the valley to the families who had been forced to sign them away under threat of debt they'd never truly owed. It was not Levi's rifle nor 30 Apache warriors who finally brought Crane down. In the end, though both had kept him alive long enough to see it happen, it was the plain, patient weight of the law itself, moving a good deal slower than a bullet, but landing a great deal harder in the end, exactly the kind of justice a man like Crane had never once believed could actually reach him out here. If you're glad you stayed for the rancher who rode toward danger and the chief's daughter who tested him first, here's a quick ask. Becoming a channel member, just tap, join beside the channel name, helps more of these frontier stories reach people who'd love them as much as you do. Levi's arm healed slow through that summer, the wound leaving a scar he'd carry the rest of his life, a mark he came to think of less as an injury and more as a kind of record. proof of the night he'd stopped merely surviving on that ranch and started actually living on it again, fully, without holding half of himself back the way he had since Mara died. Elu stayed close through all of it, first out of plain necessity, changing bandages and checking the wound for fever with the same brisk competence she brought to everything else. And then, as the weeks passed and the necessity quietly stopped being the real reason either of them showed up at the creek, simply because neither of them wanted her anywhere else in the world, she still corrected his pronunciation of her language when he mangled it, still laughed at him more often than was strictly necessary, still let him know plainly when he was being stubborn about mending his own fences instead of resting a still healing arm, but she no longer needed to translate quite so often between two worlds that had begun, slowly and without much ceremony, to overlap into something closer to one. The rebuilt barn went up that summer, with the Hollis family's help and a handful of Elu's own people lending their hands to the framing, an easy, unremarkable cooperation that would have seemed impossible to either side a year before, and now seemed, to everyone doing the actual work, like the most natural thing in the world. Old Prewitt brought over tools he hadn't touched since his own wife passed, saying gruffly that a barn only rose faster, with more hands on the beams, and less talk about whose hands they were. The Hollis children trailed after Taji all afternoon, begging him to teach them words in his language the same patient way Elu had once taught Levi his, and Taji obliged them with far more good humor than his earlier teasing of his sister might have suggested he had in him. By the time the new roof went up, dry and solid against the coming autumn rains, nobody on that stretch of the valley much remembered or cared to remember which family had raised which section of it. One warm evening near the end of that summer, Elu's father rode down from the ridge alone, without the 30 warriors this time, just an old man on a tired horse coming to see for himself how the rancher's arm was healing and, though he didn't say so outright at first, how his daughter was faring in the company of the man she plainly intended to keep choosing, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. He found them together at the creek, exactly where this whole story had first turned itself around 3 seasons before, Levi's arm no longer bound, Elu's hand resting easy and unremarkable in his, the way a thing rests once it has entirely stopped being new or uncertain. The chief watched them a long moment before speaking, through no interpreter now, since Levi had learned enough of the language by then to follow most of it unaided, a fact that seemed to please the old man a great deal more than he let show on his face. "My daughter has made clear she intends to stay here. I will not stand in the way of a choice she has already made with her whole heart, and I would be a poor father indeed to try and fail at forbidding what cannot be forbidden anyway." Elu, listening, stayed silent, only leaning a little further into Levi's side, which carried everything that needed carrying between the 3 of them. They were married that autumn, in a ceremony that borrowed pieces from both worlds without apologizing for either one, vows spoken in 2 languages. A fire built the old way at the center of the gathering, Mara's name spoken once with real tenderness rather than grief by a groom who had finally made his own peace with loving 2 women across one lifetime, without either one canceling out the other in his heart. The Hollis family came, and old Prewitt, newly restored to his own water rights, and visibly moved by the whole occasion, wiping at his eyes with the back of one weathered hand,
and pretending it was only smoke from the fire. 30 Apache riders who had once watched this ranch in cold, silent judgment now watched it instead in open, unguarded celebration, singing songs Levi had only half learned and would spend the rest of his life gladly finishing the learning of. Taji stood up at the fire that night and toasted his new brother-in-law with a story about the day 3 of Crane's men had gone home limping from a fight with his sister and one stubborn rancher, telling it with such relish that even Levi found himself laughing at his own bruises in the retelling. Elu wore, alongside the dress her mother had woven years before and left unfinished, a small strip of blue cloth from one of Mara's own old sewing scraps, stitched in by Levi's own uncertain hand, as a private tribute neither of them explained to the gathered guests, and neither of them needed to. 2 families that had started out as strangers, one white and one Apache, became on that day something closer to a single family, not through any paper filed at the county office, not through any law the marshal's badge could ever enforce, but through something a great deal older than either one of those things, the plain, difficult arithmetic of 2 people choosing the same side of a line, not because it was the easy thing to do, but because it was the only side either of them could look at in a mirror afterward and fully recognize as their own.
Mara had understood a version of that same arithmetic once herself, long before Levi ever met her, hiding a wounded stranger from soldiers who'd have killed him without a second thought, a choice she'd never fully explained, because some choices simply don't need explaining to the person who makes them, only living out. Levi came to understand it fully the moment he turned his horse toward a scream, cut short at the creek instead of away from it, not knowing who was screaming, not knowing what it would cost him before the whole thing was through, only knowing that a woman was in trouble, and that was reason enough, exactly as it had always been reason enough for Mara at 16 years old in a root cellar with a stranger's life in her hands. One more thing before this particular story closes for good. Tap join beside the channel name to become a member. It genuinely helps keep frontier love stories like this one alive on this channel. Years afterward, when their own children wondered aloud how their parents had first met, Levi and Elu recounted it the same way every time, trading the story back and forth between them the way 2 people do when a memory has been shared so long it belongs equally to both of them now, rather than to either one alone. Their own children, 3 of them by the time the youngest was old enough to ask the question properly, grew up moving easily between both grandfathers' worlds the way their parents had learned to, spending summers at the creek, learning their mother's language from Taji's own children, and winters at the ranch, learning their father's trade from the same hands that had once mangled a single word for water badly enough to make a young Apache woman laugh out loud at a stranger for the first time. It started with a scream at the creek that a young rancher could easily have ridden away from and simply didn't. It continued with 3 days of silent watching neither of them knew was happening at the time. It nearly ended in fire and blood on a night neither of them much likes to describe in full even now, all these years later. And it settled in the end into something neither of them had truly expected to find again, after everything the frontier had already taken from each of them separately before they ever met at that creek, 2 families joined by
by something older than any paper, built by a man and a woman who each, in their own separate and difficult ways, had learned exactly what it meant to turn toward trouble instead of away from it, and who kept choosing each other after that. Plainly, and without a shred of regret, every single morning that followed for the rest of their lives together,